She was driving home after a long day when a police officer stopped her and accused her of car theft. He roughly pulled her out of the car without giving her a chance to explain. He thought she was just an ordinary woman. But within seconds, everyone was shocked. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. The highway shimmered in the fading light, a long stretch of quiet asphalt leading out of the city toward the darkening hills. The world outside her windshield was soft gold and blue, the kind of calm that came only after sunset. Ronda Rousey drove with one arm resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other draped over the console, her thoughts drifting somewhere between exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. The seminar had gone well. She had spent the afternoon talking to young women about strength, not the kind measured in punches or belts, but the kind that holds steady under pressure, the kind that doesn't flinch when the world pushes too hard. That had always been her message, even when she stood in the cage with the lights blinding her and the roar of the crowd pressing against her skin. Control, composure, power that served purpose, not ego. The hum of the tires and the faint rhythm of the radio filled the car, blending into a kind of peaceful silence. The streets were nearly empty, a few scattered vehicles gliding between intersections, headlights cutting through the dusk. She rolled down the window, letting the wind touch her face. For the first time in weeks, she felt a little human again. Not a public figure, not a headline, just someone driving home after a long day. When the red and blue lights flared behind her, the first reaction wasn't fear, but confusion. She looked instinctively at the speedometer under the limit, the fuel gauge steady, nothing unusual. The light stayed close, weaving slightly to signal her to pull over. She blinked once, sighed, and guided the car smoothly to the shoulder, parking under the amber glow of a streetlight. In her rearview mirror, she saw the patrol car stop, door open, and a figure emerge. The officer was young, maybe early 30s, fit, with the kind of posture that came from training and the kind of expression that came from habit. He walked briskly toward her car, one hand resting on his holster, the other holding a small notepad. His face was blank at first glance, but something about his eyes was sharp, appraising, too focused for a simple traffic stop. She lowered the window and placed her hands visibly on the steering wheel. "Evening, officer," she said calmly, though her voice was soft enough that the word nearly blended with the sound of passing cars. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned her face, then her car, then the license plate. "This vehicle is listed as stolen," he said abruptly. "Step out of the car." Rhonda blinked once, the words not quite registering. "I'm sorry?" "Out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone sharper now. "Hands where I can see them." Her training, both as an athlete and as a disciplined professional, kicked in. She didn't argue. She didn't question him yet. Calmly, she turned off the ignition, unbuckled her seatbelt, and kept her movements slow, deliberate, every gesture visible. She opened the door and stepped out into the warm night air. The pavement still held the day's heat beneath her shoes. "My name is Ronda Rousey," she said quietly. "This car belongs to me. I can show you the registration." He ignored her words, circling around the car like a wolf scenting its prey. "You'll have time to explain that later," he muttered. "Right now, keep your hands on the hood." Something in his voice was off, not official procedure, not caution, but irritation. It was the tone of someone who wanted a reaction. Rhonda felt the edge of a familiar tension rise in her chest, the instinctive alertness that years of fighting had sharpened. She placed her palms flat on the cool metal of the hood, the reflection of her own face distorted in the glossy surface. He stood behind her, too close. The night air thickened, the faint smell of his cologne mixed with the metallic tang of her car. "You from around here?" he asked. But it wasn't curiosity, it was bait. "I'm local," she answered evenly, "and this car isn't stolen. You can check the VIN number against the registration. It's in my glove box." He didn't check. Instead, he pressed her shoulder, harder than necessary, pushing her chest slightly against the car. "I'll decide what's necessary," he said. Her jaw tightened. Her instinct told her to stay still, to let him finish whatever this was, to wait for it to de-escalate. But the pressure on her back increased, his voice growing rougher, the power in it no longer professional but personal. "Officer," she said carefully, "you're making a mistake." That was enough to tip him. He grabbed her wrist suddenly, twisting it behind her back. Pain flashed up her arm, sharp and immediate, though she didn't make a sound. He pressed harder, testing her limits. "Stop resisting," he barked, though she wasn't moving. She felt the world narrow into sound and pressure, the clink of his handcuffs, the heat of his breath too close to her ear, the whisper of her pulse hammering against her throat. The training she'd taught so many times whispered in her head, "Stay calm, control the breath, don't let the adrenaline make the choice." She exhaled slowly, trying to focus her mind. "Officer, I am not resisting," she said again, steady as stone. "You're hurting me." His hand tightened. The metal of the cuffs bit into her skin. He slammed her against the hood with such force that the car rocked slightly. Across the street, a porch light flickered on. Someone was watching, but no one intervened. "Keep your mouth shut," he hissed, her cheek pressed against the hot metal. The night no longer felt peaceful. The same street that had looked empty now seemed infinite, echoing, full of invisible eyes. She could hear his breathing, uneven now, angry. He was enjoying this. She realized it then. Not a misunderstanding, not an overreaction. This was something darker, practiced. The back of her mind ticked through the details she would later need. His name tag read Miller, his badge number barely visible under the reflection of her car's lights. The camera on his chest flashing red every few seconds. It was recording, or at least it was supposed to be. He grabbed her by the arm again, this time yanking her upright. "Face me," he ordered. She did, eyes level, unwavering. For a brief second, his gaze flickered with uncertainty, as if her calm unsettled him. Then he smirked. "You think because you're famous, you can talk your way out of this? You're all the same." Rhonda didn't reply. She looked at him the way she'd once looked at an opponent across the octagon, measured, patient, waiting. She could feel her body calculating possibilities, even as she refused to act on them. Every move, every muscle, ready. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against her hip under the pretext of checking for weapons. It was no longer procedure. It was humiliation. Her heartbeat slowed, the way it did before a fight, slow enough to think, cold enough to choose. Behind them, a car passed. Someone honked once, uncertain. The officer turned his head slightly, shouting, "Move along!" The car sped off. Rhonda stayed still. She could feel the bruise forming where his hand had pressed her against the hood, a dull ache spreading through her ribs. The anger wasn't in her voice yet. It was in the way she controlled every breath, refusing to give him the satisfaction of fear. After what felt like forever, he stepped back. "We're going to the station," he said. "You'll explain there." She met his eyes. "You're arresting me for driving my own car?" "For resisting arrest," he snapped. "Get in the back seat." He opened the patrol car door, gesturing sharply. Rhonda hesitated for half a second, not from fear, but calculation. She could end this right now. She could take him down without breaking a bone. But that wasn't who she was anymore. The moment she crossed that line, she'd become what he wanted her to be, another threat to justify his violence. So she walked, her wrist bound, the metal cutting deeper into her skin. She sat in the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut behind her. The inside smelled of disinfectant and worn fabric. Outside, the streetlight flickered, and in its rhythm she saw the pattern of injustice. Bright, dark, flashing endlessly through the night. As the car began to move, she caught her reflection in the window. Calm, bruised, unbroken. She watched the city slide by, the glow of storefronts and homes blurring into streaks of light. Her mind was already working, not as a victim, but as someone cataloging every detail, the location, the time, the witness across the street, the angle of the body camera's lens. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and humiliation, there was a familiar spark. It was the same one that had carried her through every round she'd ever fought, the one that turned pain into focus. She knew what was coming. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The cruiser turned down a narrow side street, leaving the glow of the main road behind. The city seemed to close in around them. Smaller houses, darker alleys, the hum of the engine the only sound. Rhonda closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Control the breath. Control the outcome. When the car stopped, she opened them again. The officer stepped out first, adjusting his belt, glancing back at her with the same cold smirk. "Don't try anything," he said, though she hadn't moved. She smiled faintly, an expression that wasn't quite defiance but something close. "I won't," she said softly, though the words were for herself, not for him. As the door opened and the humid air met her face again, she stepped out, her posture still proud, her eyes calm, and somewhere deep in her chest, a promise began to form. A quiet, fierce vow that the night's injustice would not be forgotten, and that the next time he looked into her eyes, it would not be as an enforcer, but as a man confronted by the truth of what he had done. The sound of the car door closing behind her echoed like the start of something inevitable. And as they walked toward the sterile lights of the station, Ronda Rousey carried herself not like a prisoner, but like someone gathering strength for a fight far greater than any she had faced in the ring. The night swallowed them both, and the city, indifferent and watchful, waited for what would come next. The holding area of the precinct smelled of stale coffee and worn linoleum. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, giving the corridor a pale, almost medical coldness. Rhonda sat on the metal bench, hands cuffed in front of her now, wrists ringed with raw red marks. Her breathing had long since steadied, but inside her chest, something sharp and steady pulsed, an awareness that every second of this was wrong, that the story was already being rewritten around her. The same officer Miller stood by the door, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his face set in an expression of tired superiority. "You like attention, huh?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "Figures. You people always do. Cameras, lights, crowds." Rhonda looked up at him, her voice low but even. "I didn't ask for this attention. You created it." He chuckled, tapping his thumb against the grip of his holstered gun. "You think you can talk to me like that? You're under arrest, lady. You don't get to talk." "For what?" she asked. "For driving my own car?" He stepped closer. "For resisting an officer of the law? For acting like rules don't apply to you? For thinking that fame puts you above procedure?" "There was no resistance," she said calmly. "And if there had been, you'd be the one with a broken arm." Something flickered in his eyes at that. A split second of doubt, or maybe pride wounded by truth. He laughed it off, though it came out thinner than before. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," she replied. "I didn't fight back because I know how far that goes. I've seen what happens when people like you lose control." He leaned down so close she could feel his breath. "You think you scare me?" She met his stare without flinching. "No, I think you scare yourself." The sound of another door opening interrupted them. A sergeant passed by, glanced in, then moved on. The silence that followed felt heavier. Miller straightened, muttering something under his breath, and left the room. The door locked behind him. For a long time, Rhonda sat alone, tracing the rhythm of her pulse against the cool steel of the cuffs. She thought of the faces she had seen from the car, the woman on the porch, the man across the street, the faint glow of cell phones capturing pieces of truth. There were witnesses. That meant there was proof, and proof meant this could be fought. An officer she didn't recognize eventually came in, a younger man with uncertain eyes. He unlocked one cuff and gestured for her to stand. "You're being processed," he said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "It's standard procedure." She followed him down a narrow corridor to a small desk. The same hum of lights followed them, constant and sterile. He asked her to sign a paper acknowledging her detention. She read every line before touching the pen. "It says I resisted arrest," she noted. "That's a lie." The officer hesitated, his gaze darting to the security camera mounted above them. "Ma'am, I just need your signature." "Una." Rhonda stared at him for a moment, then signed it next to her name. She added 3 words in small, deliberate letters. "Under duress." False claim. He saw it and swallowed hard but didn't erase it. He simply collected the paper and stepped aside. "They're bringing you to holding until morning," he said. "I want to speak with a supervisor." "They'll see you tomorrow," he answered, and she knew from his tone that he didn't believe it either. When they led her to the cell, the night had already deepened. Through the barred window, high on the wall, She could see nothing but a sliver of orange light from a street lamp outside. She sat on the cot, back straight, and breathed through the ache in her shoulders. Across the hall, two other women whispered in low tones. One of them, a thin woman with tired eyes, looked over at Rhonda. "You that fighter?" she asked softly. Rhonda nodded once. "What did they get you for?" "Existing," Rhonda said. The woman gave a faint, knowing smile. "Happens a lot around here." Hours passed. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, a phone rang and rang before being picked up. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, fading again. When the door finally opened, it was Miller who entered. His sleeves were rolled up, his jaw tight. "Let's go," he said curtly. "Where?" Rhonda asked, standing but keeping her distance. "Questioning. And don't start with the attitude." He escorted her down another hallway, this one darker, the paint on the walls peeling. The interrogation room they entered looked less like a room for truth and more like a trapped metal table. 2 chairs, no window. He closed the door behind them. "You could make this easy," he began, tossing a file onto the table. "Sign a statement, say you overreacted, we clear it up, you walk out with a fine, or we do it the hard way. Paperwork, charges, court. The press eats you alive." Rhonda tilted her head. "You're offering me leniency for something I didn't do." He leaned closer, voice low. "I'm offering you a way out. You've got a career, fans. You don't want your face on the news in an orange jumpsuit." "You mean you don't want your face there?" she said quietly. "Because when the footage surfaces, and it will, you'll be the one explaining why you assaulted someone in broad daylight." He smirked. "You think anyone's going to see that footage? You think that body cam didn't have an upload glitch?" The words hit her like cold water. He knew. He'd already tampered with it, or planned to. "You erased it," she said slowly. He shrugged. "Technical issue. Happens all the time." She stared at him, the controlled calm returning to her voice. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "Lady," he said, straightening, "the biggest mistake of my life would be letting someone like you humiliate me." He moved around the table until he stood beside her. Too close again, the tension almost physical. She could feel the heat of his anger, the insecurity beneath it. "You think you're tough," he said softly, "but you're just another loudmouth with a following. Out there, you might win fights. In here, I make the rules." Rhonda looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "Then your rules are about to change." The door opened suddenly. The younger officer from earlier stepped in, startled to find them so close. "Sergeant, Lieutenant wants to see you. Now." Miller glared at him, but didn't argue. "Stay put," he said to Rhonda, then left, slamming the door behind him. The moment he was gone, the younger officer exhaled. "Ma'am," he said in a hurried whisper, "I saw the report. I know something's wrong. There were witnesses outside. People recorded what happened." Rhonda's pulse quickened. "Do you have names?" He shook his head. "No, but the dispatcher mentioned uploads to social media before they got pulled down. If someone saved them, it could help you." "What's your name?" she asked. "Holt," he said. "Officer Dan Holt." "Thank you, Officer Holt." "Remember that name you just gave me, because one day I'll make sure it's written in the right report." He looked both relieved and nervous, then turned toward the door as Miller's voice echoed in the hall. "He's coming back," Holt said quickly, and slipped out through the side exit. Miller entered moments later, irritation clouding his face. "Change of plans," he muttered. "You're staying overnight." "For what reason this time?" He gave her a thin smile. "For my peace of mind." Rhonda leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You're afraid," she said finally. His laugh was short and hard. "Of you? Please." "No," she said softly. "Not of me. Of what happens when people see who you really are." He stood frozen for a moment, jaw clenched, then turned away, opening the door. "Enjoy your stay." When he was gone, she sat in the stillness, the faint buzz of the lights the only sound. Her wrists ached, her ribs burned, but her mind was sharper than ever. The pieces were forming, the glitch, the witnesses, the arrogance. He thought the system would protect him, that the badge made him untouchable. Rhonda had seen that same confidence in opponents who underestimated her. Men who thought brute strength could outmatch discipline. They always made the same mistake. They swung first. She waited. And when they left an opening, she ended it. This time would be no different. Only now the cage was bigger, the stakes higher, and the audience, the world, was watching. The morning came with no sunlight, only the pale flicker of fluorescent bulbs that hummed inside the narrow corridor. Rhonda had barely slept. The cot in the holding cell was little more than a metal frame with a mat that smelled of bleach. But it wasn't the discomfort that kept her awake. It was the memory of Miller's hand pressing her into the hood of her car. The heat of humiliation and the cold precision of her own restraint. She had replayed every second of it through the night, over and over, like footage she was preparing to present as evidence. Every word, every movement, every witness she could recall. That was how she fought now, not with fists, but with clarity. When the door opened, she was already sitting upright. Miller stood there again, the same sneer curling his lips, his badge gleaming too brightly in the sterile light. "Let's go," he said. "You're being moved." "Where?" "Interview room. They want another statement." He didn't bother with cuffs this time. He grabbed her by the arm, tighter than necessary, and led her down the hallway. The other officers who passed them didn't make eye contact. They all knew who she was. Some recognized her with a flicker of surprise or discomfort. Others simply looked away, unwilling to interfere. The silence of complicity hung heavier than words. The interrogation room was smaller than the night before. No mirror, no camera, no table. Just 4 walls painted gray and a single chair. She felt it immediately. This wasn't an official procedure. This was something else. Miller pushed her inside, closed the door, and locked it behind him. The click of the latch echoed like a gunshot. "Sit down," he said. She didn't move. "Where's the recording equipment?" "Don't worry about that." "Where's the other officer?" "You think you get a private escort now?" he said, stepping closer. "You're not special here." Rhonda stared at him, her stance steady, her back straight. "If you touch me again, you'll regret it." He laughed, the sound low and dangerous. "Is that a threat, Miss Rousey?" "Because it sounds like one." "It's a warning." Something in her tone wiped the amusement from his face. He moved closer, his jaw tight. "You really think you're still in control, don't you? You think that name means anything in here?" "It means I've spent half my life learning how to handle people who mistake power for strength," she said. That made him snap. He grabbed her wrist suddenly, twisting it upward. The same cruel movement as before, only harder this time. The pain shot through her arm, but her face didn't change. He slammed her against the wall, his forearm pressing into her collarbone, his voice a snarl in her ear. "You don't talk back to me," he hissed. "You don't tell me what I can or can't do." She didn't respond. Her breath came slow and measured, her body waiting. Years of discipline had taught her the art of stillness, the moment between instinct and action, the half-second that separates control from chaos. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing on the edge of that half-second. He hit her once, a backhanded strike across the face. It wasn't powerful, not compared to what she'd faced in the ring, but it was enough to cross the final line. The room spun slightly, her cheek stung, and the world narrowed to a single, razor-sharp thought. Enough. Her next movement was instinct, precision born of endless repetition. She shifted her weight, dropped her center of gravity, and twisted under his arm. In the same breath, she caught his wrist, pivoted, and used his own momentum to throw him to the ground. The thud of his body against the floor cracked through the silence. He tried to grab for her leg, but she moved faster. Years of training translating into fluid motion. In a blink, she locked his arm between her knees, applied pressure to the joint, and immobilized him completely. "Don't make me break it," she said, her voice calm and level, her breath steady. Miller groaned, struggling against the hold, but every movement only deepened the pressure. His face reddened, sweat breaking across his forehead. "Let go," he spat. "You attacked me," she said. "Again. And this time, you're going to explain it on record." She loosened her grip just enough for him to breathe, but didn't release him. The door burst open, 2 officers rushed in, guns drawn. The sight of the sergeant pinned helplessly on the floor by an unarmed woman froze them in place. "Drop her!" one of them shouted. Rhonda slowly lifted her hands, still sitting upright on the floor, releasing Miller. He assaulted me, she said evenly. You can check the marks on my arm. Miller scrambled to his feet, furious and humiliated, shouting incoherently. She attacked me. She resisted again. Restrain her. The younger officer from the previous night, Holt, appeared behind the others. His eyes darted from Rhonda to Miller, to the faint bruise darkening on her jaw. Something in his expression changed. Sir, he said carefully, there's a security camera in this corridor. It records audio from inside the room. I think we should— Shut it, Holt, Miller barked. Get her cuffed. Holt hesitated. With respect, Sergeant, I think Internal Affairs will want that footage. The words hit the room like a slap. The other officers froze, exchanging uncertain glances. Miller's fury faltered. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was losing force. Rhonda stood up slowly, deliberately, the quiet confidence in her movements commanding more authority than any badge in the room. Check the camera, she said to Holt. You'll see everything. Holt nodded once, his jaw tight. Yes, ma'am. Within minutes, she was escorted back to her cell, not with the rough hands of before, but with silent, careful distance. No one spoke. The rumor had already begun to ripple through the building. When the door closed behind her, she sat on the cot again, her pulse finally beginning to settle. She stared at the faint line of light under the door, thinking of Holt's face, of the way he'd stepped forward when no one else had. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but something had shifted. The truth was leaking through the cracks. Hours later, the heavy clang of the outer doors echoed again. She heard raised voices in the hall, Miller's among them, sharp and frantic. Then another deeper, calmer voice replied, a different authority. The door to her cell opened. A woman in a dark suit stepped inside, holding a folder under her arm. Her badge identified her as a federal investigator. Ms. Rousey, she said, I'm Agent Torres. I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight. Rhonda looked at her steadily. I've been waiting for someone to ask. The agent studied her face for a moment, then nodded toward the bruise forming along her jaw. You're bleeding. Do you need medical attention? I've had worse, Rhonda said. What matters is the footage. Torres gave a small, knowing nod. We've already pulled it, and you're right. It's all there. For the first time since the night began, Rhonda allowed herself to exhale fully. The fight was no longer physical. It had moved into a different kind of arena, one where evidence, not punches, determined victory. But as she looked at the agent, she knew the battle had only changed shape. The man who had tried to humiliate her wasn't just one bad cop. He was part of something larger, a system that let people like him believe they could do this and walk away clean. When Torres left, promising to return in the morning, Rhonda lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Her face ached, her arms throbbed. But beneath the pain, there was clarity. She had survived worse. And now she had what she needed, the truth, recorded and undeniable. Outside, dawn was just beginning to break, a thin light filtering through the narrow window of the cell. It touched the corner of her face, and she closed her eyes briefly, letting it warm her bruised skin. She wasn't done. This was only the opening round. The morning sunlight was sharp and unwelcoming, cutting through the narrow slats of the blinds in the interview room where Rhonda now sat. Her wrists were still red from the cuffs, her face marked by a fading bruise along the jawline. But her eyes were clear, steady, and alive with that controlled energy that came before a fight. Across the table sat Agent Torres, calm, professional, her dark suit pressed, her pen tapping against the file in front of her. Let's start from the beginning, Torres said. You were stopped on Route 18 around 9:30 last night. The officer claimed your vehicle was listed as stolen. Rhonda nodded. That's what he said. I showed him my registration. He ignored it. And after that, he escalated, grabbed me, pinned me to the hood. I complied with every command, but he kept going. When he hit me, I reacted. Reacted how? Rhonda met her gaze evenly. I disarmed him without harming him. Controlled response. I stopped when he was neutralized. Torres didn't write anything for a moment. There's footage, she said finally. From the corridor. You were right, it captured everything. He attacked first. The internal review is already in motion. Rhonda leaned back slightly. Then you know this wasn't just one man losing his temper. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't afraid of getting caught. Torres sighed quietly. You're not wrong. Sergeant Miller's record shows multiple complaints, mostly excessive force, a few allegations of planted evidence, all dismissed internally. Which means the problem's bigger than him. Torres closed the folder slowly. That's what we intend to find out. For a moment, silence filled the room except for the ticking clock on the wall. Then Torres stood. You're free to go, Ms. Rousey. The charges are dropped. Rhonda didn't move right away. The words didn't sound like relief. They sounded like the end of the first round. And him? She asked. He's suspended pending investigation. Officially, Torres said. Unofficially, he's already panicking. He's been trying to pull strings inside the department. Rhonda stood up, her muscles aching, but her composure intact. Good, she said quietly. Let him panic. By the time she stepped outside, the media had already gathered. The news had spread overnight, an officer assaulting a woman under the pretense of an arrest, only to be overpowered when she defended herself. But the headlines weren't kind. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions overlapping into noise. Rhonda, is it true you attacked an officer? Did you use excessive force? Do you regret what you did? She paused just long enough to face them. I regret that anyone has to defend themselves from the people meant to protect them, she said, then walked past the crowd. A few steps away, Holt waited near his patrol car, his uniform crisp, his face drawn with guilt and determination. Ma'am, he said, lowering his voice, I wanted to tell you I filed a statement about what I saw, and I made copies of the footage before the file was locked down. Rhonda's eyes softened slightly. That was brave, Officer Holt. Keep them safe. They'll come for it. He nodded. I know, but someone has to do the right thing. She glanced toward the station doors where Miller stood behind the glass, glaring. Their eyes met for a brief, frozen moment. His face was pale, tense. The confidence from last night drained away. Rhonda didn't look away. She simply stared back until he shifted his gaze first. The next days unfolded like the slow unraveling of a tightly wound knot. The footage went public. It hit the morning news, then national television, then every social media feed in the country. The clip was short, just a few seconds of violence followed by Rhonda's quiet, decisive counter, but it carried the weight of a much bigger story. Pundits debated her every move. Some praised her restraint, calling her a symbol of discipline in the face of abuse. Others twisted the narrative, suggesting she'd provoked the attack, that her background as a fighter made her dangerous. It didn't matter. The truth had already taken root. Miller's world began to crumble. More people came forward, drivers, mostly women, who claimed they'd been harassed or falsely cited by him. A pattern emerged, too precise to ignore, and with each revelation, the department's silence grew heavier. Torres called her 2 days later. We found something, she said. A series of falsified traffic stops linked to private towing companies. Cars marked as suspected stolen were being impounded without due process. The company collecting them has ties to a former deputy chief. Guess who signed most of the authorizations? Miller, Rhonda said. Exactly. We believe it's part of a profit scheme. The more stops he made, the more impounds, the bigger the cut. Rhonda was silent for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling over her. He thought he could get away with it because he already had, she said finally. People like that don't stop until someone forces them to. Then I suppose that's what you did, Torres replied. Rhonda didn't answer. She stood by her window watching a cluster of reporters still camped outside the building across the street. She had never wanted this attention, but she also knew what it could do. Public pressure could move mountains faster than any report. Later that night, she appeared on a live interview. The host asked the usual questions about fear, about strength, about whether she felt vindicated. Her answers were simple, direct. I didn't want to fight, she said, but when a fight comes to you, you have two choices. Let it define you or use it to reveal the truth. I chose the second. The clip went viral before the show even ended. Within hours, hashtags demanding an investigation into the department trended nationwide. Lawyers, activists, and victims began reaching out, sending testimonies, video clips, old records. It became a wave, one that couldn't be stopped. Miller tried to retaliate, going on television to claim he had been assaulted in the line of duty. But the footage spoke louder. His union distanced itself. The department suspended him officially, but rumors spread that he was negotiating immunity in exchange for naming his superiors. Ronda didn't celebrate. She spent her days quietly avoiding cameras, focusing instead on the statements and evidence Torres's team was compiling. When she met with Torres again, the agent showed her a stack of reports nearly 3 inches thick. "This goes higher than we thought," Torres said. "The towing company is owned by a man named Roger Dixon, former city council member. He's connected to 3 current officers and the police union treasurer. It's a web, and Miller was just the muscle." Ronda leaned forward. "Then pull the web apart." Torres smiled faintly. "We're working on it. And whether you like it or not, Miss Rousey, you've become the face of this case. People are paying attention because of you." "I didn't ask for that." "I know, but sometimes justice needs a face the public recognizes." When Ronda left the office, the air felt cleaner somehow. The city was buzzing with movement, but for once, she wasn't running from it. She was part of something larger, a reckoning that had started with one corrupt cop and would end only when every link in that chain broke. That night, she stood on her apartment balcony, looking out over the lights. Below, traffic hummed. Life went on. But she knew somewhere in the quiet parts of the city, there were still people like Miller, protected by the same silence that had nearly buried her. Not anymore. The truth was out, and once exposed, it spread like wildfire. Her phone buzzed, a message from Holt. "They're reopening old cases. It's working." Ronda allowed herself a small smile, the first in days. The bruises had faded, but the memory hadn't. It wouldn't. And that was good. Pain could be fuel if you used it right. She turned back toward the skyline, her reflection faint in the glass. The next fight wasn't in the ring. It was in the courtrooms, the streets, the headlines. But for the first time, she wasn't alone in it. The system had tried to silence her. Instead, it had given her a voice that echoed louder than ever. In the city, its lights, its people, its truce long buried, was finally starting to listen. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and tension. Cameras lined the marble steps outside. Reporters pressing microphones toward anyone who looked remotely connected to the case. Inside, the crowd murmured in waves, waiting for the proceedings that would finally drag months of hidden corruption into the light. Ronda sat near the back, a black jacket over her shoulders, her posture calm but her gaze sharp. She hadn't come as a fighter or as a celebrity. She was here as a witness. This time, she didn't need her fists, only the truth. Agent Torres sat beside her, reviewing the files for the 100th time. "We've got Miller's testimony on record," she said quietly. "He's flipped, claimed he was following orders from his captain. It's not a clean confession, but it's enough to open the books." "And Dixon?" Ronda asked, her voice low. Torres sighed. "Still denying everything. His lawyers are arguing that the towing contracts were standard city agreements, but we've traced the bank transfers. The money flows from his company straight into accounts belonging to 6 officers, including Miller." Ronda leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "So he built a business out of stealing from the people he swore to protect." "Pretty much," Torres said. "But without the public outrage, none of this would have seen daylight. Your case forced them to act." Ronda looked around the courtroom. Every seat was filled. Reporters, activists, citizens, even officers from neighboring districts. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what her story had revealed. When Miller was brought in, the room went still. He looked thinner, pale under the fluorescent lights, his uniform traded for a suit that hung too loose on his frame. He didn't glance toward Ronda. She watched him anyway, searching for some sign of remorse. There was none, only exhaustion. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of shuffling feet filled the air like wind before a storm. The prosecutor began by playing the footage that had started it all. The screen flickered to life, and the room watched the moment of the traffic stop. The harsh command, the unwarranted aggression, the strike, and the swift, disciplined counter that ended with Miller on the ground. Ronda's name had traveled far since that night, but seeing it play out again brought back every heartbeat, every breath she'd measured to keep herself from losing control. When the video ended, the silence that followed was suffocating. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "This wasn't an isolated act of misconduct," she said. "This was the visible tip of a system designed to exploit power. And the victim of that system, Ms. Ronda Rousey, refused to stay silent. Because she didn't, we now see the full scope of the crime." The defense tried to shift blame, claiming Miller was manipulated, that he was pressured by department quotas. But Torres had prepared too well. One by one, the documents appeared: falsified reports, altered timestamps, unlogged towing fees. Then came the witnesses' citizens who had been harassed, their cars taken without cause. Each story mirrored the next until the pattern became undeniable. Ronda listened in silence, her face unreadable. But beneath the surface, she felt that same mixture of anger and vindication she'd carried since the night it all began. When the defense finally called Miller to the stand, his voice trembled slightly. "They told me to flag cars," he said. "Said if I kept the numbers high, I'd get promoted. Dixon's company took care of the towing. We all got a cut. It was supposed to be easy money." The prosecutor's tone hardened. "And the night you arrested Ms. Rousey?" He swallowed. "She was never on the list. I saw her car, recognized her name, and thought I could make it look good, say, I stopped someone famous. I didn't expect her to fight back. And when she did?" He hesitated, his voice breaking. "I lost control." Ronda's hands tightened in her lap. Torres glanced at her but said nothing. The admission hung in the air, echoing louder than the murmurs that followed. By the afternoon, Dixon himself was called to testify. He walked in with practiced confidence, his silver hair immaculate, his smile rehearsed. But the weight of evidence began to erode it quickly. Torres presented the financial records, the messages, the falsified documents. With every page she handed to the court, his composure cracked a little more. When the prosecutor asked him directly if he had ordered Miller to fabricate vehicle theft reports, his answer came too fast. "Absolutely not." But the next exhibit proved otherwise. A recorded conversation between Dixon and the former police captain, discussing the revenue from false impounds. His face drained of color as the audio played, his voice unmistakable on the recording. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel struck wood again and again, calling for order. Dixon sat frozen, his empire collapsing around him in real time. By the time the session ended, the charges were clear fraud, conspiracy, abuse of power. The web had been torn open. Miller would serve time, the captain would face federal charges, and Dixon's company would be seized by the state. Outside, the courthouse steps were a sea of cameras again. Reporters shouted questions, flashes burst like lightning, but this time Ronda didn't avoid them. She stood before the microphones, her voice calm but firm. "This was never about me," she said. "It was about the people who were told they had no voice. It was about what happens when power goes unchecked. I didn't plan to become part of this story, but I'm not walking away from it either." One reporter shouted, "Do you forgive him?" Ronda paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. What happened will stay with me and with a lot of people. But what matters now is that it won't happen again." The crowd erupted in applause, though she hadn't intended to inspire it. She turned away, stepping down the marble stairs into the evening light. The air smelled of rain, heavy and electric. It felt like the world itself was exhaling after months of tension. Later that night, she met Torres and Holt in a quiet diner off the highway. The hum of neon lights flickered across their faces as they sat in the corner booth. Holt looked younger without his uniform, almost relieved. "You did it," he said. "They're talking about reforming the towing program. New oversight, new leadership." Torres nodded. "The governor's office called. They're establishing an independent review board for police misconduct. You might even get a formal apology." Ronda gave a small, dry laugh. "Apologies are easy. Change isn't." Torres smiled faintly. "Maybe. But you've started it. That's more than most people ever manage." They ate in silence for a while. Outside, rain began to fall, washing the streets clean. For the first time in a long while, Ronda felt something close to peace. Not triumph, not yet, but the kind of stillness that comes when the storm finally begins to pass. When they parted ways, she stood by her car for a long moment, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. The city lights blurred through the drops, soft and distant. She thought of all the people who'd come forward, all the voices that had joined hers, and she realized that justice wasn't a single victory, it was a chain reaction, one truth igniting another. As she drove away, the wipers sweeping across the windshield, her reflection flashed faintly in the glass. The fighter in her was still there, but she had become something more now, a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to be silent. Even when the whole world tells them to stand down, the city loomed behind her, bruised but alive, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The fight wasn't over, but it was finally moving in the right direction. Weeks passed before the city began to breathe again. The courthouse steps were no longer filled with cameras, and the news cycle had moved on to new scandals, new tragedies. But the effects of what had happened remained, woven into the daily rhythm of Riverbend. New oversight boards had been sworn in, audits were underway, and the police department had been forced into a slow, painful reckoning with its own rot. For Rhonda, life had quieted, but only on the surface. The peace felt unfamiliar, like a calm sea hiding deep currents beneath. She sat in her gym early one morning, long before her first private class. The heavy bags swayed slightly from the movement of air, the scent of leather and chalk familiar and grounding. For weeks, she hadn't trained. Not properly. Her body had needed rest, her spirit too. But now, as she wrapped her hands and felt the old rhythm return, she knew she wasn't coming back to the ring for competition. She was coming back for balance. When the door opened, she wasn't surprised to see Agent Torres step inside. The woman had a way of appearing quietly without ceremony, always dressed in that same dark suit, her expression somewhere between professional detachment and quiet admiration. "Still can't sit still?" Torres asked, folding her arms. Rhonda threw a slow combination into the bag measured, controlled. "Rest isn't my strong suit. I can tell. You've been hard to reach. Needed space." Torres nodded, stepping closer. "I get it, but you might want to hear this. The DOJ's report is complete. It's official systemic corruption, falsified reports, illegal impounds. Dixon's assets have been seized, and Miller took a plea deal. 5 years, no parole." Rhonda stopped, the sound of her breathing loud in the empty gym. "And the others? Half the department's leadership is under review. 2 captains resigned this week. The mayor's holding a press conference tomorrow." Rhonda gave a faint, humorless smile. "Guess they finally learned how to count accountability as part of their statistics." Torres chuckled softly. "You should come to the conference. They're giving commendations to key witnesses and civilians who aided the investigation." "I didn't do it for a medal." "I know," Torres said, "but sometimes showing up matters more than speaking. It reminds people why change started in the first place." For a long moment, Rhonda said nothing. Then she nodded once. "Maybe I'll think about it." Later that day, she drove through the same streets where it had all begun. The sun was high, the air warm, the neighborhood quieter than she remembered. The intersection where Miller had stopped her now had a new camera mounted above the traffic light, its red light blinking steadily. Across the street, someone had set up a mural painted in bold strokes of red, white, and blue. It showed a woman standing tall against a wall of shadowed figures, her hand lifted not in violence but in defiance. Beneath it, the words, "Justice starts with one voice." Rhonda pulled over, stepping out of her car to look. A small crowd had gathered nearby, snapping photos. One of them, a teenage girl with curly hair, noticed her and froze. "It's you," she whispered. Rhonda smiled faintly. "It's all of us," she said, then got back into her car. The next morning, she kept her word and attended the press conference. The city council chamber was packed again, but this time, the mood was different, hopeful, determined. Reporters filled the aisles and citizens, some of whom had testified, lined the walls. The mayor stood at the podium, his voice steady as he read the findings of the investigation. "For years," he said, "our system allowed power to go unchecked. But because brave individuals refused to stay silent, we can begin to rebuild trust. To Ms. Ronda Rousey, to Agent Torres, and to every citizen who spoke up, you reminded us that justice is not a slogan. It's a fight." Applause rippled through the chamber. Cameras flashed, but this time, they didn't feel like intrusions. Rhonda didn't step forward for recognition, didn't wave or bow. She stood in the back beside Torres, hands clasped, expression calm. Afterward, outside the building, reporters tried to approach, but Torres intercepted them with a quick shake of her head. Ronda stepped into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on her face. It had been months since that night, but she could still feel the cold metal of the car hood, the sharp taste of fear and fury. The difference now was what followed. The fear had turned into strength. The fury had turned into focus. Later that evening, she drove to the small neighborhood gym she'd once trained at before fame, before chaos. The owner, a gray-haired veteran named Pete, greeted her with a grin. "Didn't think I'd see you in here again," he said. "Couldn't stay away," she replied. "Good. We've got a girls' class starting in 10 minutes. They could use someone like you to show them a thing or two about staying on their feet." Ronda laughed quietly. "Guess I can do that." When she stepped onto the mat, the chatter in the room stilled. A dozen young girls, no older than 15, stared at her with wide eyes. She didn't lecture, didn't talk about justice or fame. She just showed them how to move, how to stay balanced, how to breathe, how to use an opponent's strength against them. After class, one of the girls lingered. "Miss Rousey," she said shyly, "is it true you fought a cop?" Ronda smiled softly. "I defended myself. There's a difference." The girl nodded slowly, processing the words. "Were you scared?" "Of course," Ronda said. "But being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you still care about what's right." That night, when the gym was empty, Ronda sat on the bench outside, listening to the faint sounds of the city cars in the distance. Laughter, life moving on. Torres joined her not long after, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you'd still be celebrating," Torres said. "I am," Ronda replied, taking a sip. "Just quietly." Torres looked out toward the streetlights. "You know, most people would have let it go, tried to move on." "I couldn't," Ronda said. "I've seen what happens when no one fights back. My father used to tell me, strength isn't what you do when things are easy. It's what you do when you've been hit." Torres smiled faintly. "Guess he raised a fighter." "He raised someone who knows when to stop fighting too," Ronda said. They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't need words. Across the street, a mural artist was adding new names under the painting, people who had come forward since the trial. The wall was filling up fast. When Torres finally stood to leave, she paused. "You ever think about joining us? Internal oversight? Federal task force? Something bigger?" Ronda looked at her thoughtful. "Maybe one day. But for now, I think I'll teach people how not to get knocked down." Torres laughed quietly and walked away. As the last light of evening faded, Ronda glanced back at the mural one more time. The painted figure stood tall beneath the words, "Justice starts with one voice." The artist had added something new that afternoon, a faint golden line tracing upward from the figure's hand, like the first spark of sunlight after a storm. She smiled to herself. Justice, she thought, was never about winning. It was about refusing to lose what mattered most: dignity, courage, and truth. She stood, feeling the night breeze lift her hair, and started walking home. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, promising rain, but this time she didn't mind. The storm had already passed, and she had walked through it standing tall. If you were moved by Ronda's story, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Every week, new true power stories that will shock you, inspire you, and keep you watching till the end. Share this video with your friends. Let them see how one moment of courage can change everything. And stay tuned. The next story will hit even harder.